first of all saying that this is a project that's still in development, and so I apologise if it's not as tightly woven as Robert's paper. This came out of I was asked to give a guest lecture for a Gender Studies 101 class on Black Swan, and there's surprisingly little scholarship on it. I only found two, a chapter in a book and one journal article that closely dealt with it. But there was a surprising amount of kind of blogosphere activity around the film. And who has not seen the film? No? So we're all familiar with the plot. Excellent. So it was released to a very divisive audience. People tended to either love the film or hate the film. And quite passionately too. And I think that, you know, one of the reasons why people hated the film was primarily because they felt that the use of multiple genre codes, which we're all quite familiar with, the kind of body horror, psycho-melodrama, they felt that those codes hadn't been synthesised together well enough, and that they were really just kind of a kind of hash, cobbling of really overdone mother-daughter drama, you know, the cloistering mother and the heavy use of mirrors and symbolism. As one put it, blogosphere commenter put it, Black Swan is a frustrating experiment in genre and in theme, and it squanders its opportunity to be genuinely terrifying film about the anxieties of femininity, choosing instead to be a rather mediocre horror movie that by the end descends into camp. And I think that, you know, that was kind of one side of why people hated the film. The other side was, of course, largely the work of the feminist blogosphere, who really hated the film because they thought it represented a depiction of the representation of women within patriarchal conditions, and therefore felt that there was kind of no subversion of these dominant codes of how women are represented in film, and that the film therefore, you know, was a tragedy in a sense. Those who did enjoy the film, I think, found it difficult to say why they enjoyed it. A lot of people just sort of said, look, I don't know that I get it, but I loved it. You know, I went with it. I sort of just let go of not knowing why and just went there. And what I'd like to do today is actually kind of address this question of what genre the film is and propose that it is in fact a tragedy. And that it uses ballet as an art form as a metaphor to explore the tragic effects of negating the real in a kind of Lacanian real sense. I don't think that ballet as an art form would ever meet Nietzsche's criteria for the highest form of tragedy, that is Attic tragedy of the 5th century BC. But Black Swan, the film, as a performance and indeed as an experience for the audience, might be said to produce the effects of tragedy. And that, in turn, we can think of it as a tragedy. So I want to explore the film through Nietzsche's critique of Attic tragedy in The Birth of Tragedy, and actually draw on the recent work of Tim Femi, who looks at both Nietzsche and Lacan on the question of ethics, and certainly explores both of their work on tragedy, to look at how the film depicts Nina's ascetic ballet body, to explore the effect of foreclosing the real as a kind of tragic lesson for us all. I think Black Swan actually, you know, a second argument is that it articulates a contemporary problem in feminist discourses regarding an anxiety towards the real of the drives, and to a form of feminine jouissance in being the object. And this is evident, I think, in feminist responses to the film that express anxiety about the woman being the object in the film, which is sort of phrased as a kind of persecutory male gaze. The way that these, and in focusing on this, there's a kind of negation of the real of sexual difference, the real of the drives, and overlooking that this element of the film is kind of the tragic flaw of the heroine, which we get to experience in the film. So, sorry, I forgot to put that up. classical tragedy. I don't want to kind of go over this too much. I'm sure we're all quite familiar with Nietzsche's thesis in The Birth of Tragedy, where he argues that, you know, throughout history, through each epochal phase of artistic production, the varying impulses of Apollo and Dionysus have shaped and given form to artistic production and practice. In the 5th century, these dual artistic impulses of Apollo and Dionysus finally synthesize in harmony rather than swaying back and forth between the two gods, and bring form the strongest form of artistic expression of tragedy. So Apollo being the bringer of light, associated with form, rationality, associated with classical aesthetics, symmetry, order, of inspiring kind of Doric architecture and the beautiful illusions of epic drama and Homeric poetry. Apollo is associated with individual consciousness. In contrast, Dionysus is represented as a form of kind of self-shattering in ecstatic being. As opposed to the form of individual consciousness, we might, to quote Nietzsche, most immediately understand Dionysus through the analogy of intoxication. Following Schopenhauer, Nietzsche describes the shift from Apollo to Dionysus as the dread that grips man when he suddenly loses his way amidst the cognitive forms of appearance. But coming with this shift is also blissful ecstasy, which, prompted by the same fragmentation of the individual, rises up from man's innermost core, indeed from nature. So there's a kind of joyful experience in Dionysus, in penetrating nature, in losing the forgetting of the self and becoming one in the orgiastic state of ecstasy. I think this is quite an important point in terms of thinking about Dionysus as being related to the real of the drives. In terms of thinking about Dionysus as a kind of primitive and powerful element, there's a destructive quality to Dionysus. The loss of individual consciousness might be seen as a type, something to fear, but it is nevertheless, we might kind of make a parallel analogy here with a kind of you know, the anxiety of the real, like the fear of, well, if I lose consciousness, you know, I'm something of me is being destroyed, but there's a kind of pleasure in that destruction. Nietzsche describes it as pain experienced as joy. Tim Themy holds that the divinities of the Greeks were sexualized bodily divinities with their origins in the real that expressed aspects of the drive. And therefore, we can't think of them as originating from imaginary ideals, but instead from inner portions of the real as it shows itself to us in our dreams and imaginaries. And I think this is quite an important distinction for thinking about Dionysus in particular. When in Attic tragedy, these gods were on stage, they were not, you know, they were literally kind of became the actors. They, as to quote Tim Themy, bestrode the earth, a blast of corporeal passions, invoking a different relation to law akin to the potlatch not long past. Here our taboos on sex, death, rapturous frenzies, and forbidden truths could be briefly suspended. And I think this is quite important for thinking about what tragedy offers us in terms of suspending forbidden truths, which I'll come back to. Some of the key elements of tragedy, as Tim Themy argues, is its ethical component, understood by both Nietzsche and Lacan as being articulating something of the real of the drives through that Dionysian impulse, which is sort of given enough form and shape and beauty through Apollo to make it tolerable for us to experience. As Themy puts it, Nietzsche valued tragic art for its ability to present us with the harshest, most amoral truths of our existence, without also subjecting us to nihilism, pessimism, and despair. For Lacan, he says, tragedy can lure us to face the difficulties of the human condition by using beauty effects that teach us about desire in a way that is crucial for informed ethics. So how can we understand tragedy or Black Swan as a tragic drama? One of the kind of key elements of tragedy is that usually for the hero, the race is run. we know what's going to happen to the hero at the start of the play, and therefore we don't, as Nietzsche says, get caught up in thinking about, plot and who did what and what such and such affected that person, but rather because we know, we can see the tragic fate of the hero and we know it through the sort of subtle devices of the playwright, we can be completely immersed in the sufferings and actions of the protagonist. We can breathlessly participate in their suffering and fear. Now, you might say, well, at the start of the film, we don't know what Nina's, the heroine of Black Swan, we don't know what her fate is. And we don't even really know that this is a tragedy per se, and I only found one or two people who kind of made that final connection that this was a tragedy. At the start, we kind of tempted to think that this is a kind of naturalistic film, but then of course we enter into all the kind of heavy use of genre tropes that the film offers us. And I think this is where people get confused and think, oh, it's a body horror film. It's what Williams calls the body genre, where the use of things like psycho-melodrama, like the question of, is this all in Nina's head? What is real and what is imaginary in this film? The elements of discomfort, where we get, we encounter these kind of body horror moments, the splitting of the toes, the peeling of the cuticles to extreme points, which make us feel uncomfortable. They produce a kind of discomfort, anxiety in the audience. And we are looking at these codes, trying to figure out what this film is about. So, arguably, people might think, well, it's not a tragedy from that point of view because we're too preoccupied trying to figure out what the film is about. And there's a point at the film where I think we have to just let go of trying to figure that out and go with Nina on her tragic journey. But I do think that these body horror elements, the sort of psycho-melodrama elements, and the thriller elements actually help produce the tragic effects, which I'll kind of go on to look at. The effects of our encounter with the real. So there's a point in which we just have to go with Nina's psychosis, and we have to breathlessly participate in her suffering and fear. On the other hand, Nina does have a kind of tragic quality in that she, like a Sophoclean hero, is kind of at a limit. In her radical kind of psychotic state, she is really at a limit between life and death, as Lacan sort of describes Antigone as being, at this kind of threshold. And she is, like a Sophoclean hero, basically bent on a course that will ultimately end in her own destruction. And this is a course she can't go back from, and she is extremely obstinate in this course. Though we might say she initially shows fear about kind of going on the path she knows she has to go on to get the role of Odette and Odile, she might be tentative initially, but she's obstinate. She does not back down before her desire to get this role, whatever it will take, and obviously it will take her own self-destruction. But I think this initial fear shows us the anxiety of the real that has been foreclosed in Nina. And I think this is actually the identification point for some of the feminist viewers who share Nina's anxieties of the real, as I will kind of go on to argue. But if Black Swan is a tragedy, then what are the forbidden truths of Black Swan? What does the ballet metaphor offer us as a tragic metaphor? The crux of the plot, I would argue, is that Nina presents to us as a Balanchine ballerina, which I'll go on to sort of talk about. Basically, the Balanchine ballerina is under the sway of Apollo, and it's a very ascetic body. She has to learn how to synthesize something of the Dionysian into her performance in order to achieve the spectacular kind of performance that she wants. And to get the role, the director, Tomei, tells her that this is what she doesn't have. She lacks this Dionysian quality. So the crux of the plot revolves around this kind of point. Now, it seems unlikely, given the quite aesthetic qualities of classical ballet in the 21st century, that we could understand the ballet Swan Lake itself as a tragedy. But in order to understand the tragedy of Black Swan, I think we need to look at the history of Apollo and Dionysus in the history of ballet, to understand how Nina ends up as this kind of ascetic ballerina. So, for a very quick, brief history, ballet begins in the 15th and 16th century in the European royal courts, and initially it's not performed on a stage. It's actually just part of the social interaction, courtiers learning particular dances and steps and performing them at court. And this is a kind of like, you can see, it's all about patterns on the floor that can be sort of observed from above or from onlookers, and the bulk of the art is really about sort of courtly mannerisms. It's all about epaulement, the shape of the shoulders and the head, and sort of very small, elegant and refined gestures. There's nothing boisterous about it. There's nothing athletic about it. And it is, quite Apollonic in that it is trying to produce the illusion of beauty. But as we head into the 18th and 19th centuries, and we move on to the stage, we get obviously the development of choreography and gestures and narrative, and we get the formulation of the kind of classical romantic ballerina, who tries to embody a very imagined sense of aristocratic and bourgeois 19th century femininity, very refined, elegant, not of this world. We get a kind of, we get the development of point work, so the illusion of not being of this world, of skimming the floor. We get point work, as Garofalo argues, ushers women into a realm of perpetual maidenhood, that idolised version of the separate female sphere, constructing a female body as more spirit than flesh, more abstract than real. So we get quite an Apollonic image in that, or impulse behind this kind of artistic practice. It's Marie Taglioni, one of the most famous ballerinas of the time. However, we also get this quite strange contrast during the 19th century, where this ballerina was no longer part of the aristocracy. She is a performer, and she holds the status, of many performers of the day as being kind of a, little more than a prostitute. And it was well established that aristocratic gentlemen could fund the careers of ballerinas in return for sexual favours, and that was a well-known fact and established practice. At the same time as this Apollonic image is kind of they try to craft this Apollonic image, we also get this dual fact. We've got the fact that she is basically available for sexual entertainment and pleasures, and of course we've got this kind of contrast to the woman on stage bears her legs and feet, her arms are available, if she lifts her leg a little bit high, you can get a bit of a glimpse. It was common to try and get a front row seat so you could look up her skirt. The diaphanous skirts, of course, kind of, under the floodlights reveal more than you would ever see of a woman, in your everyday life. If she bends down, you might be able to get a bit of a peek. Also, ballet by now has, developed more boisterous choreography. Women moving and expressing themselves in ways that genteel women would not be able to do in any other circumstance. And we certainly have, as Susan Garb articulates, the kind of Dionysian impulse which the work of Degas kind of tries to depict, in that ballet is erotic at this point. It is titillating, and if you want to go to a sex worker, you could, but this is like the next best thing to an erotic spectacle. Like the availability of the woman on stage had an erotic element, and we can see this in Degas' work, where he kind of captures a lot of the on-stage work, but also the off-stage work, where the ballerina is kind of has her legs inelegantly spread, in the wings. And you can see a lot of his early sketchings where he looks at the models to sort of develop, this is not the depiction of a woman in the 19th century, right? This is a particular other type of woman. So there's like a strange erotic Apollonian Apollo in the form, but sort of an impulsive eroticism in Dionysus there as well. And then, of course, we've got Nina basically personifying the Apollonic part of this equation. She is, as Tomai tells her, you know, perfect for the role of Odette. Like, she has mastered Apollo here. She's got the technique, she's got the form to recreate a 19th century ballet like Swan Lake. But at the turn of the 20th century, actually taking direct inspiration from Nietzsche, the ballet world decided to try and incorporate a more Dionysian impulse in their work. And so you get the Ballet Russe, Diaghilev's choreography, literally reading the birth of tragedy and trying to come up with more abstract and expressionist forms of dance and choreography, trying to find a Dionysian Greek chorus in the dance. I think at some point we've got Susan Jones looks at this in quite an amount of details. She says there's a consideration of dissonant and conflicting drives where the individual is drawn into a choral dance of frenzied expression and of communal identity. And of course we see this in the work of Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, where we have the sacrifice of the young girls. And in particular, Georges Balanchine gets inspired by this as well, and he produces two ballets that are sort of significant. We've also got, you know, the woman loses all the kind of accoutrements of the balletic form. She loses the point shoes, she loses the corset. Costume and choreography is all about trying to express more Dionysian impulse. But Balanchine comes up with two ballets, Apollo and Agon, which kind of explore these both aspects of Nietzsche's work, not just the Dionysian impulse. Agon came later. Apollo actually went through many revisions, and when it first started, it was about, in the 1928 version, Balanchine had, you know, Apollo's kind of artistic journey as his birth, his adolescence, and his kind of maturity as an artist. But by 1979, this is the version of Apollo that we get, and we've lost any of the Dionysian. It's all about form, beauty, line. You know, it's pure Apollo. There's nothing Dionysian about it. And this is essentially Nina. She is a Balanchine ballerina. This is Agon, which a description of Agon is actually quite interesting. Agon is atonal and without melody. It's full of shapes, phrases, rhythms, sounds that hadn't been encountered before, that embody New York's modernism, but it remains a really difficult ballet. Nobody finds it easy to say what it's about. The sound world and the body language are full of conjunctions that baffle even while they excite. And I thought that's actually kind of almost how we might describe Black Swan. It baffles even while it excites. But this Balanchine body, the Balanchine ballerina that Nina personifies, and there's many allusions in the film to the fact that the company she's at is the New York City Ballet, which is Balanchine's company, and that Tomai is a kind of Balanchine director who takes, his prima ballerina as his muse. Even though it's quite ascetic, there is no depth to the real in this body. There are no breasts, there are no hips. The excessive work of technique and ballet itself means that frequently the ballerina's body weight's too low to menstruate, so there's not the kind of gradual fluctuation of the body. It's still a heavily gendered body because it tries to recreate the form of the 19th century ballerina, but in a completely abstract way, in a completely Apollonic way, without that kind of sign of Dionysian or sign of the real there. And I think this is really important because this is where Nina is, and she's striving to perfect this abstract body that has no depth to the real. And it's at this point where she has to try and incorporate some of the Dionysus back into her performance. The gendered body that she presents is, I think, as well, quite interesting. I mean, just to sort of riff off something you were saying at the start of your talk, the idea that, in a way, the film is almost kind of critiquing that gendered ideologies in a way by, I don't agree with the kind of feminist responses that say that the film presents women in an ideological way. I think they're actually trying to critique and engage with that and show us the tragic effects of this heavily gendered body that has no depth to the real. Okay, so Swan Lake as a tragedy. Well, Swan Lake as a metaphor. I think one of the key claims about Swan, the film, was that it played off the virgin whore binary through the trope of the white swan, black swan. And I think it's a fairly easy critique to make because obviously there was a lot of heavy symbolism about that. But just even looking at the plot of Swan Lake, that metaphor doesn't quite translate. For anyone who doesn't know, the ballet itself is about a young maiden who is abducted by von Rothbart, turns her into a swan. The spell can only be broken by true love, so she has to get a guy to kind of promise to love her. And of course, Siegfried happens to be on the threshold of his adulthood, and his mother wants him to choose a wife. He meets Odette, falls in love. Yep, I'll choose you at my party tomorrow night. The big ball is held, and he has to choose a bride from the assembled women. Von Rothbart sends his daughter Odile in Odette's place and makes her look like Odette, so Siegfried doesn't know what's going on, and he commits to love Odette. So So Odette suicides. The spell can't be broken, she thinks, so she throws herself in the lake. Siegfried follows her, and this show of true love is what breaks the spell. Black Swan is nothing like that. It's not a heterosexual romance. Nina doesn't need a guy to save her or break her spell or, get her to sort of recover from her psychosis. Her journey is it's the hero's journey, it's her tragic journey. So I kind of wanted to point out that the correlation there doesn't quite work. Swan Lake itself, we might say, as a ballet, is very Apollonic, and it is very sort of hints to the kind of what maybe Nietzsche would call dramatized epic. It doesn't have the genuine Dionysian impulse that would make it a tragedy. In contrast, Nina is not about good triumphing evil, as we might say Black Swan is. Swan Lake is sort of a morality tale about good and evil. However, the first scene of the film does indicate to us that, to a certain degree, Nina's unconscious is kind of stuck in that good-evil, virgin-whore binary. So critiques of the film that say that Lily is her rival and kind of depicted as a whore as opposed to Nina as the virgin. Obviously the symbolism is really heavy there. Lily has black wings on her back. They're constantly dressed in both either white or black, so we get this sense, hammered home symbolically throughout the film that these are the two tensions. But actually, it's Beth who is kind of the black swan, if you will. It's Beth who Nina needs to learn from the Dionysian qualities. Beth is described in quite Dionysian terms as being quite destructive, but that's what makes her so exciting. She's exciting to watch because one never knows what she's going to do, but at the same time, that exciting quality kind of makes her self-destruct, and she does self-destruct. 5 minutes? Okay. If we have a look, the film which I was going to show, we're running out of time, so I won't show it. The opening dream sequence, we see Nina's dream sequence. She dreams she's going to become Odette. And I want to sort of argue that this is like a kind of unconscious wish to also become the Black Swan, but she can't acknowledge it, right? She can't acknowledge the Black Swan element. And the dream plays out in a kind of Death and the Maiden scene, and the character of von Rothbart has horns and is quite sort of satanic. And I think that indicates the unconscious place of the real of the drives for Nina, so that they come out expressed through projection. And so I want to argue Lily is not kind of the Christian whore to Nina's virgin. Lily is the projection onto which Nina projects all her fears about the real, all her fears about this kind of Dionysian element that she has up until now repressed in the pursuit of her Apollonic body with no debt to the real at all. And I think we can see that in a number of kind of situations. I mean, we constantly see her projecting herself onto other women, specifically Lily. And I think after the dream, she comes out and she looks at this poster of Beth, and I think that's the kind of real kind of point of transgression that she needs to be able to cross, and she needs to learn from Beth her Dionysian qualities. The projections of, like, this scene where she comes out of the bathroom, so she's got the part, she calls her mum, she's wrapped, she comes out of the bathroom, someone's written whore on the mirror. It's sort of not clear who has done that, and I've watched the film a number of times trying to see, I don't think there's anyone in the bathroom with her, and so this to me seems like a projection. So a kind of, because she has repressed the real, it comes out in distorted form, as Freud would say. So whenever we get these kind of projections of the whore, it's actually Nina's fear that she hasn't attenuated those qualities into herself, so they come out in distorted form. And as they come out again, when she sees Lily having sex with Tomai and then sees herself there, she's kind of exploring through Lily all the material that she's not explored before. And of course, I think this is quite clearly related to the mother. And I'll just skip through here. The claustrophobic and obviously very unhealthy relationship with the mother. The mother, you know, one of the critiques of the film is that we don't know what Nina's desire is. What's her pursuit? Why would she pursue this role? It's clear that her desire is caught up with the mother's still. There hasn't been a sort of proper separation. And we see that with the cake. So when the mother tries to feed her the sugary cake and she rejects it, and it's like, we can't actually acknowledge that we have different desires. No, you have to have the cake. And they were kind of overclose that scene by, all right, I will have the cake, just so that we don't acknowledge that I have separate desire from you. But of course, then she does try to sort of go through that breakaway with the mother. I haven't had time to sort of touch on this question of the gaze, which I really wanted to get to, and I'm sorry I couldn't get through that, because I think it's important to think about the anxiety of the gaze that we get in feminist critiques of the film. It's precisely the work of a ballerina to attract the gaze, and it's precisely what Nina can't do. You know, she's perfected her technique. But Tomei says to her, I don't care about your technique, you know, I want you to excite me. I want you to excite yourself in your performance. Your ability to excite the audience's gaze is precisely the lesson that Beth has to teach her, that kind of Dionysian impulse, like being able to incorporate that into a more holistic sort of space. You know, looking at, if anyone's been reading Lacan's Seminar 10, which has just been translated, he looks at sort of anxiety of being a signal of the real. And I think the anxiety of the gaze of the other operates in the film, and certainly in kind of feminist critiques of the film, as an expression of the real, which with the gaze comes the question of, you know, who am I for the other, comes the question of sexual difference. And one of the things I think the film sort of articulates for us is that, you know, if you don't address the real of sexual difference, you know, it will come back to sort of in the form of the repressed. And I think, in a sense, this is kind of the tragic tale that the film has to offer us, and I'm sorry for kind of lumping all that in at the end there. But to sort of close, you know, I think the tragic point is that the question of sublimation, which many people sort of scoffed in the film, they sort of saw that was part of the film's task. You know, Nina has to incorporate Dionysus and sublimate it more holistically into her performance in order to succeed, and people scoffed at that and said, why does she have to be sexy to be a good performer? But I think, you know, instead of thinking about it being sexy, the task is she's repressed the real. She's tried very hard to, maintain this Apollonic body rather than a real body, and in repressing that, it's come back to haunt her, and she can't attenuate it, she can't sublimate it because it's been repressed. So she has no knowledge of the drives. Lily, on the other hand, is a character, perhaps is not the greatest performer in the world, perhaps her Apollonic ballet technique is not perfect, but she has knowledge of the drives which she can then sublimate because she's engaged with them rather than repressing them. And as a film, I think that's kind of one of the tragic lessons that it offers us, that we can't repress, we've got to at least acknowledge the drives and the real of sexual difference. And I'll leave it there. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, we've got a little bit of time for questions. Sorry, we're running a bit over time, but that clock is a little bit fast. So yes, we'll have a little bit of a joint question time.